Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really so pleased to be here. This is such an incredible event and space. I'm so sort of like impressed with what you guys are doing here, and I feel like I have so much to learn from you. So hopefully I'll have a couple of things to say that will be maybe of interest. I just want to also especially thank Kathy High for organizing this, for putting all the effort into creating this and making this possible, to Ellie Irons, to Brenda Miller, and the numerous other people that I've met just in the last hour or so. Clearly there's an incredible team of people who are all working to make this happen. So I'm really thankful to be here and humbled by all of your work. I also want to say that that we're gathering here on the unceded territory of the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican land, and that we're very close to their sacred burial ground. And when I reached out to ask about whose territory it was that I was going to be presenting on and then coming to, I was really impressed by the kind of very elaborate and careful things that you've been doing in this community to really actually acknowledge those connections. So I learned, for example, that the community, the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican peoples, have been in Wisconsin since the 1800s due to multiple forced removals from our homelands in the river valley since Henry Hudson and beyond, and that this area is also home to Mohawk peoples, and also, of course, to probably numerous other indigenous peoples, as we recognize that we're all moving, around in this current moment in time. I also want to say, when I feel like it's really important to give a kind of territorial acknowledgement, but to also say that I'm an uninvited guest here. And I say that in part just to acknowledge the fact that under non-colonial situations, what would actually happen is that there would be a series of protocols that we would go through, that I would go through, in order to be invited here and to actually be welcomed here by the peoples whose territory this is. And in part because of the colonial conditions that we live under, a lot of these protocols have been broken, and I'm just beginning to learn about some of the ways in which this is meant to be happening, and I think that we all have a long way to go. But I think it's important to acknowledge that. I also wanted to say that much of the work that I'm going to be presenting to you tonight was developed in relationship with Zoe Todd. So it's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is based on an article that we co-wrote together. And Zoe, unfortunately, can't be here today. She's amazing. If you don't know her work, I would highly recommend it. She writes very prolifically on a blog, so even if you're not keen on academic writing, there's lots of her writing that you can access. She's a very accessible writer. But she can't be here today because of a sort of ongoing health issues. And I want to address the fact that those ongoing health issues are a result of the fact that the academic institution that she is currently working in and the place where she did her PhD, there was so much stress on her as an Indigenous person and constantly fighting against a colonial institution that it has resulted in these health problems. And to just sort of call on all of us who are white and who have the kind of privilege of being a white person in this society, to really reach out to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color faculty to really see what we can do to help with the process of decolonization, because this shouldn't be. It's our responsibility ultimately, and so I just wanted to also flag that as well, that we need to find better ways to support Black, Indigenous, and people of color within academic institutions. So just to say a little bit about myself, I'm a settler. I grew up in Métis, Ojibwe, and Chippewa territory in Pinawa, Manitoba, and then in Algonquin, Anishinaabeg territory in Deep River, Ontario. And Zoe is a Métis, and she grew up, and I unfortunately cannot pronounce this word, but so I'll just use the English translation, which is Edmonton. if you want, I can show you what it looks like, but I'm going to do a bad job if I try saying it out loud. So my comments tonight were also going to be confined to North America, so primarily Canada and the United States. And I'm doing this not because I want to exclude other kinds of knowledges or because I think that knowledge from this part of the world is the most important. I actually don't. But I do think that it's really important to speak from the positions that you know. And these are the territories and these are the governments that I'm familiar with. So that's where I'm going to be speaking from. And in relationship to sort of all of this, as a settler, and I will be presenting a lot of Indigenous folks in the talk, and I want to just highlight something that Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang said in this really brilliant essay that they wrote a while ago called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And they say, solidarity is an uneasy, reserved, and unsettled matter that neither reconciles present grievances nor forecloses future conflict. So I want to highlight this. So there is something kind of deeply troubling and uncomfortable that I'm working through in relationship to these questions of decolonization, especially as a white person who's engaging with Indigenous literatures, that I think is actually really productive. I think it's productive to feel somewhat uncomfortable in relationship to these questions. So that's my very long preamble. I'm gonna talk, and then we'll have some question and answers. But if there's anything at any point that is really unclear, feel free to just sort of jump in and ask. So decolonizing the Anthropocene. So I was going to start with what exactly do I mean when I say what is the Anthropocene? So many of you are probably pretty familiar. How many of you kind of know what this concept is? So like half or majority, 3/4-ish. Okay, so I'll just give you sort of a brief roundup of what the Anthropocene is, which is basically the period, the proposed geologic epoch that would come after the Holocene. And it has been recommended for official adoption by the International Geologic Congress. They have yet to vote on it as a body. The recommendation was made in August 2016, and they will most likely vote on it sometime within the next year or so. So we'll see whether or not it enters into the official geologic record. But just for those of you who are potentially unfamiliar, it's a way of just being able to group together and call attention to the fact that our current era is marked by so many things that are related to humans. So things like radionuclides, plastics, other kinds of toxic chemicals that you can actually literally see in the band of the earth. You can also see things like, so chicken bones are also part of what the markers of the Anthropocene are. There's all kinds of other things that are markers of the differentiation between the Holocene and then what potentially comes after. And there's been all kinds of objections to this term, right? So one of the things that myself and Zoe have been calling attention to, and others have in different ways, is the periodization of the Anthropocene. So some people initially, when it was proposed as a concept back in 2000 by Eugene Stormer and Paul Crutzen, then at that point there was debates over when it could possibly come about, and one of the sort of proposals was that it would be contiguous with human agricultural practices. Another proposal was that it would start with the birth of the steam engine. Another proposal would be that it would start sometime in the 1950s. The proposal that Zoe and I favor is the one that starts in 1610, because then it marks it in relationship to colonization, specifically colonization of the Americas. And so these were the original proposed kind of geologic markers, the dates at which it potentially would start. The International Geologic Congress seems to be favoring the 1950 start date, approximately the mid-20th century, because that's when you sort of see, if any of you have seen all those hockey stick graphs, that's when you see things really kind of escalating out of proportion. So it's when all kinds of things start, like you see a massive increase of phosphorus, for example, and the attendant the release of phosphorus into the atmosphere, or into the sort of biosphere more generally, and the attendant algae blooms that go along with that. It's when you see the massive increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's when you see, the massive, the initiation of when all the nuclear bombs started going off. So it's this particular moment in time that marks all of these things. And so, why would Zoe and I object to that kind of a marker? Ourselves and many other people, including Donna Haraway, as Nancy was saying, have proposed that the Anthropos is not a particularly good marker of the Anthropocene, because when you call it the Anthropos, you're including all humans, right? And you're not making a differentiation between which humans are contributing to the kinds of ecological disasters that we find ourselves in, and which humans are either not responsible or actively resisting this particular state of affairs, right? And we can think about that in terms of an individual problematic, but we can also think of that in a societal problematic, in terms of the ways in which our economies or ideologies or our assumptions about the relationship between humans and the natural world function. These are the particular reasons why people are really concerned about the word Anthropocene, despite the fact that it also has done, I think, a lot of good work in terms of being able to group together a lot of environmental problems under one term, so we can speak of things like mass extinctions and climate change and extractivism without having to name each and one of those every individual problems, but rather we can just point to the Anthropocene as the kind of agglomeration of those conditions. But the problem with that is that it imposes this universalism onto our state of affairs that in fact is just blatantly false if you actually look at how things are distributed across the world. Things are distributed incredibly unevenly. Parts of the globe are warming at incredibly rapid rates, while as other parts of the world are warming at much slower rates. So for example, in the Arctic, things are warming extremely rapidly. And so, we have to take into account the fact that there is these differential degrees of both effect in terms of these ecological problems, but also differential degrees in terms of responsibility. So this is the primary reason why people are concerned with the designation of the Anthropocene. So, the other thing that I want to just kind of clarify, because I'm going to be using it a lot as a term, is what do I mean when I say settler colonialism? So settler colonialism, as differentiated from other forms of colonialism that we've seen in places of the world like India, has the differentiation that settlers come with the intention of making a new home. So because of that, it has a particular set of key markers to it that marks it as different from different kinds of versions of colonialism that we've seen throughout history. So the first is that it's really about the land, right? So settler colonialism has this relationship to land that despite the fact that a lot of other forms of colonialism were about various forms of extraction, it wasn't about the land in the same way, right? So people are coming here and they're occupying this territory. My ancestors came not that far from here and occupied this territory as if it was theirs, right? And also in that transformation, what primarily happens is that the land is made into property. So human relations are restricted to questions of ownership in relationship to the land, right? As opposed to all of the other ways in which we could relate to the land. All of that gets squished down to one very specific kind of relationship. So along with this, in this process, a couple of other things have to happen. So one of the other things is that indigenous peoples are erased or destroyed. So obviously there was a massive, both intentional and unintentional genocide that happened in this part of the world. And I say intentional and unintentional in the sense that it was very much deliberate, but because a lot of what was happening by way of
the viruses that killed off many, many people, that part we could say is somewhat unintentional, but I think that the project is still very much intentional, right? The project was that Indigenous peoples were not understood as peoples who had sovereignty over the lands that they had intimate relationships with. And so as part of that meant that the virus kind of spread. There's all kinds of stories about how blankets were distributed knowingly with smallpox, for example. So that's one part of it. And then the other part is that because of the fact that there is this necessity for over-extraction that happens in relationship to settler colonialism, chattel slavery is also a part of settler colonialism, right? So because Indigenous peoples were killed off at the rates that they were, then you need a labor force in order to extract the value of the land under this kind of logic, right? And when I say chattel slavery, there's a complicated relationship between Black and Indigenous peoples in this part of the world in relationship to chattel slavery. So chattel slavery happened to both Indigenous and Black people who were kidnapped from Africa. So. And then in addition to all of this kind of violence and horror that's a part of settler colonialism, it also has this fundamental understanding that embedded in its logic, settler colonialism has a fundamental understanding where the ideology is that man, and I use that term very deliberately, has dominion over the earth. Right? So that there's an inherent hierarchical relationship between the relationships of humans and nature. So this is the thing that we've all inherited, right? Whether we like it or not. These are the conditions under which we have been living in this part of the world for 500 years. And regardless of how one may have ended up in this part of the world, unless you are an Indigenous person or a person descended from slaves, you are caught up in the privileged aspect of settler colonialism, right? And so, the question is like, how do we think through this condition and how might we begin to think our way out of it? So one of the things that I want to draw attention to is this quote from Kim Tallbear, and she says, "The dissemination of humans and non-humans in these continents, the decimation of humans and non-humans in these continents has gone hand in hand. When one speaks of genocide in the Americas, it cannot be understood in relationship to the European Holocaust, for example, that is, as having a beginning and an end, and which is focused on humans alone. Our genocide," and Kim is Dakota, "in the Americas included and continues to include our other than human relatives. We need kin to survive. In turn, Indigenous peoples speak not necessarily from individual courage, but rather their irrepressible voices cannot but call attention to injustices, and they continue to call the settler state to account for its failures at kin-making here with both humans and non-humans." So I draw attention to this quote in particular because I think it really shows us that these kinds of relationships with the non-human world are at the heart of thinking through what does it mean to engage with processes of decolonization. And she very eloquently explains the relationships of how genocide works differently. So when I say decolonization, what do I mean? So again, from Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, they write, "Decolonization brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life." So it's not just a call for social justice. Sometimes decolonization gets thrown around as a word to kind of indicate the ways in which we would like to have a more liberated consciousness, right? That's not what I mean. When I say decolonization is that we have to deal with the complex and violent ongoing project of settler colonialism that we all live under. So in particular, we need to really seriously engage with questions of how do we actually honor the treaties that we are all bound to? How do we actually think about things like repatriation of lands? And how do we think about questions of Indigenous sovereignty in a really strong sense? So the reason why we think that the Anthropocene in particular needs to be thought in relationship to decolonization is because the heart of settler colonialism was always about erasing Indigenous presence through the radical transformation of the land. So that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of my time here. So the Anthropocene, as the extension and enactment of colonial logic, systematically erases difference by way of genocide and forced integration of Indigenous peoples and through projects of climate change that imply the radical transformation of the biosphere. So universalist ideas and ideals are embedded in the colonial project as it was enacted through a brutal system of imposing the right way of living. In actively shaping the territories where colonizers invaded, they refused to see what was in front of them, instead forcing a landscape, a climate, flora, and fauna into an idealized version of the world modeled on sameness and replication of the homeland. So, for example, I remember being out in California a few years ago and seeing a statistic somewhere that said that 90% of the vegetation in Florida is from the post-contact era. That means that 10% of that land is what it was like before colonization. So when you think about that and extend that to the whole of North America, we can see that we've radically reshifted the hydrosphere, the geosphere, the biosphere, that the entirety of the place in which we live is fundamentally not the same as what it was 500 years ago. And of course, we all know that things change. It's not that I want things to stay and remain static, but I think that there's a difference when this project is a very conscious project that is based at the root of removal and erasure, whereas, kind of a more organic process of change over time, I think, is a fundamentally different thing. So one of the other reasons why we want to think through the concept of the Anthropocene is in the sort of logic itself. So they say in their seminal article that introduced the Anthropocene to the written canon, simply titled The Anthropocene, Crutzen and Stormer rely upon the concept of what they call the noosphere to articulate their position. They define the noosphere as the world of thought to mark the growing role played by mankind's, and again, this is their language, not mine, brain power and technological talents in shaping its own future and environment, a concept that they credit to Teilhard de Chardin and E. Leroy. The noosphere places thought above the biosphere and geosphere. So, and it is framed as a teleological progression that follows the development of the Earth's geological features and biota as demonstrated by de Chardin's writing on the concept. So in reflecting on the progression of human influence upon the globe itself, de Chardin argues, we must enlarge our approach, this is a quote, we must enlarge our approach to encompass the formation taking place before our eyes and arising out of this factor of homonization of a particular biological entity such as never before existed on Earth, the growth outside and above the biosphere of an added planetary layer, an envelope of thinking substance, to which, for the sake of convenience and symmetry, I have given the name noosphere. So, what struck us when we were reading this article and in the concept of the noosphere, and you can also see this in the concept of the technosphere as well, for those of you who might be familiar with that concept, is that it automatically and implicitly assumes that there needs to be an added thinking layer of substance onto the biology and geology of the Earth. And this is in direct contradiction to thousands of years of philosophy of many indigenous peoples, and then also streams of Western thought as well, coming out of the pragmatists in North America, and then also coming out of a lot of science and technology studies, particularly feminist science and technology studies. But in particular, Vanessa Watts elegantly articulates the concept of indigenous place thought, which is in direct opposition to a concept like the noosphere or the technosphere, drawn from her own familiarity with deeply rooted indigenous philosophies still practiced and applied in North America. Place thought necessarily disrupts a concept of knowledge separate from the geosphere and biosphere and posits instead that the land and thought are integral to one another, not another technological layer that is somehow presumed to be outside of the Earth. Indigenous place thought asserts that life and thought are animated through and bound to bodies, stories, time, and land. global colonial dispossession haunt through bones, bodies, and stories that continue to assert the removal of human thought and technology from the earth. So one particularly telling indicator of the Anthropocene that was remarked upon by two geographers, Lewis and Maslin, they note that in 1492, so when I'm speaking of genocide, this is, I think, the most horrifying kind of numbers. So they say that in 1492, there would be between 54 to 61 million peoples in the Americas, and by 1650, there were 6 million. So that's a reduction of 90% of the population. So they argue that on that basis, there was actually such a reduction in population that you can actually see a decline in carbon dioxide levels, right? So there were so many people who had been killed off and the plants regrew, and then the carbon dioxide levels declined as a result of that. And you can see that as a global marker in the geologic strata of the Earth. So what we argue in relationship to that is that colonialism, especially settler colonialism, which in the Americas simultaneously employed the twin processes of dispossession and chattel slavery, was always about changing the land, transforming the earth itself, including the creatures, the plants, the soil composition, and the atmosphere. It was about moving and unearthing rocks and minerals. All of these acts were intimately tied to the project of erasure that is the imperative of settler colonialism. The damming of rivers, clear-cutting of forests, and importation of plants and animals remade the worlds of North America into the vision of a displaced Europe, fundamentally altering the climate and ecosystems. So settler colonialism in North America and elsewhere is marked by this process of terraforming. So as Kyle White of the Potawatomi Nation argues, quote, industrial settler campaigns erase what makes a place ecologically unique in terms of human and non-human relations, the ecological history of a place, and the sharing of the environment by different human societies. So, when you think about it, like the project of erasure that settler colonialism is happening on so many different levels at the same time. There's the genocidal project where people are literally being killed, but then there's also the fact that the land that people have a relationship with is actually fundamentally transformed, right? So all of the governance structures, all of the ways in which people lived, all of the ways of knowing and being with the land are shifting under people's feet. And what Kyle makes clear in his writing, and that I think is so fundamentally important, and I'll get back to that in a second, is that we can see this again happening to us, right? Except at a global and amplified scale. And the name of that is climate change. So, So I just wanted to also point out this quote from Eyal Weizman, because I think it sums up many of these things that we're getting to. And he says, if, however, following historian Deepesh Chakrabarty, we look at climate change from the point of view of the history of colonialism, we no longer simply see it as a collateral effect of modernity, but rather as its very target and aim. In other words, what we're seeing in relationship to climate change is not a novel event, it's not a new event, but it is rather the logical extension of colonialism. So he says, indeed, colonial projects from North America through Africa, the Middle East, India, and Australia sought to re-engineer the climate. Colonizers did not only seek to overcome unfamiliar and harsh climatic conditions, but rather to transform them. Native people who were seen as part of the natural environment were displaced along with the climate and killed. Although the attempt was to make the desert green, instead the green fell fallow, lakes deadened, and oceans rose. So, marking the contiguous histories of colonialism and climate change is not for us an academic exercise. It is rather about taking stock, being affected by, and feeling the reverberations of the violence of European settlement. Colonialism rent and tore apart and disrupted the worlds in the places that we reside, these unceded and unsurrendered lands across North America that hit like a seismic shock. The seismic shock of dispossession and brutality that colonialism employed to gain entry into and claims over indigenous lands in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, this seismic shock kept rolling. like a slinky, pressing and compacting in different ways in different places as colonialism spread outwards into homelands of self-determining peoples around the globe. This work to compact and speed up time, laying waste to legal orders, languages, place story in quick succession. The violent, fleshy loss of 50 million indigenous peoples in the Americas is something we read as a quickening of space-time in a seismic sense. This seismic shock of genocide met with another one, that of the Middle Passage, again premised upon a logic of extraction and violence. So Christina Sharp describes the ongoing reverberations of chattel slavery and the rending of life worlds in the wake of the ships and ideologies that transported captured Africans across the Atlantic. She says, quote, "In the wake, the past that is not past reappears, always to rupture the present." Building on her work, we can gesture to how the entangled viciousness of capital and white supremacy have their direct roots in the epistemic violence of discovery, dispossession, extraction, and the horrific capture of life, bodies, and worlds. The notion of Anthropocene as disaster in dominant scientific and social science discourses, and we see this all the time, right? Like the kind of positing of the kind of ecological moment that we find ourselves in as this inherently apocalyptic moment, that is not a new event, right? It's the ongoing disaster of the Middle Passage and settler colonialism. So this seismic shockwave has rolled through and across space and time and is now hitting those nations, legal systems, and structures that brought about the rending and disruption of lifeways and life worlds in the first place. So I might just for the sake of being able to leave a good amount of time to have conversation afterwards, I'm just gonna maybe skip this quote. But basically, he's just talking again about the way in which climate change can be understood as a continuation of the logic of colonialism based on the foundations of what settler colonialism is, rather than something new. So he calls this the experience of déjà vu. So further, the forced displacement that many tribal communities suffered, and including the displacement of the community whose traditional land we are now on, involved adaptation to entirely new environments, to new climates, new ecosystems, new plants and animals. These processes of environmental transformation and forced displacement can also be understood as climate change, and we can also think about the Middle Passage itself as the imposition of climate change on whole groups of peoples. So, as White makes clear, the current environmental crisis can be viewed as a continuation of, rather than a break from, previous eras that begin with colonialism and extend through advanced capitalism. So in this light, the uneven impacts on the global poor of climate change can be understood not just as an unfortunate coincidence or accident, but rather as a deliberate extension of colonial logic. So unlike thinking, what he's arguing, and we agree with him, is that, unlike the ways in which people often talk about like, oh, isn't it like horrible that, the least responsible people are the peoples who are feeling the impacts of climate change the most. Well, actually, I don't think that it is just unfortunate. It's rather the weaponization of the atmosphere in order to extend and perpetuate these violences that have been going on for at least 500 years. But I think that there's all kinds of things to learn from these histories. So as Lawrence Gross says, one critical aspect of exploring the reality of Native American history is to correctly name the experience Native Americans have suffered and which they continue to endure to this day. To put it in a word, Native Americans have seen the end of their respective worlds. Using vocabulary from the study of religion, this should be correctly termed an apocalypse. Just as importantly, though, Indians survived the apocalypse. This raises the further question, then, of what happens to a society that has gone through an apocalyptic event. The effects of the apocalypse linger on, and the history of apocalypse continues to be a current-day reality for many Native Americans. So I think it's really important that we attend and tend to the fact that Indigenous and Black resistance in the face of apocalypse and the renewal and resurgence of Indigenous and Black communities in spite of world-ending violence is something that Euro-Western thinkers should heed as we contend with the implications of the Anthropocene and climate change. So again, from Kyle White, this historically brief, highly disruptive moment, today's dystopia of our ancestors, sounds a lot like what others in the world dread they will face in the future as climate destabilization threatens the existence of species and ecosystems. Yet for many Indigenous peoples, the Anthropocene is not experienced as threatening in precisely the same sense, because the particular era of settlement I am describing forced many of our societies to let go of so many relationships with plants, animals, and ecosystems at a wrongfully rapid pace. Rather, if there is something different in the Anthropocene for Indigenous peoples, it would be just that we are focusing our energies also on adapting to another kind of anthropogenic environmental change, that is climate destabilization. So in order to adequately address climate change and other environmental catastrophes, we need to seriously think through and enact processes of decolonization. This involves self-governance for Indigenous peoples, the return of stolen lands, and reparations for the descendants of captured Africans. But it also fundamentally questions the bounds and legitimacy of the nation-state structure itself. As we are already seeing, people around the world will not simply sit still in the face of ecological destruction, but will move, adapt, and try to find ways of recomposing with their kin and companion species. And so the task ahead of us is how to do this as gracefully as possible, right? So rather than repositioning the salvation of man, the liberation of humanity from the horrors of the Anthropocene in the techniques and technologies of the noosphere, or in the kinds of propositions that we see coming forward in terms of geoengineering, we call here for attending once again to relations, to kin, to life, longing, and care. And I think this is actually a beautiful space, and it seems like an incredible example of that kind of ethic in action. So this commitment to tenderness and relationships is one necessary and lasting refraction of the violent and unjust worlds set in motion at the beginning of the colonial moment. We understand that our existences are bound together, calling on us to honor these stories as motivation to tend to plural and capacious forms of healing and transformation. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you.